Ahoy! I am back and we have things to talk about. We'll talk about my disappearance in the future, but we need to address first of all some supposed problems that are happening with New World, and then we need to talk about the upcoming plans, changes, balance changes that have been announced today that are quite significantly affecting various things. Let's begin with the huge game-breaking issue that happened yesterday, which was that supposedly New World was frying SSDs. From everything that I found, that was not true. The game definitely had issues yesterday with various people having crashes, which were quote-unquote fixed today by removing two abilities from the game temporarily. On one hand, that is evade, and on the other hand, that is net shot. So that's not very fun, but that is the temporary fix they have to avoid these constant game crashes in PvP modes. But this didn't result in any SSDs getting corrupted as far as I was able to find. There were claims about that mostly originated from the same Discord. Apparently the screenshot that was used in that context was 3 years old or whatever, so it wasn't actually anything relevant at all. And also I looked into this a little bit, and to my limited technical knowledge, it's pretty much impossible for a game to outright destroy an SSD. It could maybe scramble some data on it or something, but not really make it completely unfunctional. So if you heard about that, maybe don't worry about it too much. But now let's move on to all the new info that we received today. First up, Shirking Heals. David said that the changes to Shirking Heals in the last round were a little bit heavy-handed. They're generally happy with the pace of the changes that they're making, thinking that faster changes are better, and I completely agree with that, but he thinks that the magnitude is currently a little bit too much, and they're going to make some smaller changes in the minor patches in the future instead, and just do gradual adjustments to keep things balanced, which I think is a very good approach. They say that all perks should be viable and have equal strength depending on the build, which obviously is never going to be 100% achieved, but that's the goal at least. In the case of Shirking Heals in particular, there was another issue that was kind of playing into that, which was an interaction with Ankh and the Anointed Sacred perk, healing for more than intended. So there was a lot of focus on survivability of healers, and that somehow got into these Shirking Heals considerations as well. I'm not quite sure if this is also affecting Divine, because of the Divine and Ankh interaction wasn't specifically mentioned here at least. Anyways, what the plan is for now is to reduce the cooldown back down to 7 seconds, and they will then see again how it performs there. Realistically, I'm expecting it to perform very well with a 7 seconds cooldown. I thought they would actually make the cooldown shorter but reduce the amount so that it just stays more balanced in that regard, but 7 seconds is much closer to 5 seconds than I would have expected them to bring it back down to. And I made a video that I will link right here where I talked about Shirking Heals and how strong it is now and how it compares to other perks in detail with all the values. So if you're interested in that, you can just check that out, and that will kind of show you what direction we're taking by having close to the original cooldown again. So I think Shirking Heals will be a strong performer. It's also, as far as I'm aware, not outgoing healing, so it's not affected that much by the anti-heal changes, although it is affected by the Plagued Crits buff, which applies that more often. So make of that what you will, but generally I think Shirking Heals is very much going to be back on the menu for a lot of builds. Maybe Wars will be an outlier to this, but I also don't think that Shirking Heals was designed with Wars in mind primarily. When it comes to healing, Dave has a few different goals. They want healing to be strong, and they want you to be able to save someone. But they also want you to have counters to healing instead of going for too many direct nerfs to healing, which I think is a much better approach. If Plague is in a good state and just can effectively counter heal and you can counter build healers, that makes for a more balanced game, in my opinion, than just nerfing healers down to a point where they're just not good, even if they're not being counter built. He also thinks that healers need to be somewhat risky, and in the past healers had an insane amount of survivability. I agree with that, especially in the early days, so I can understand not wanting to go too much into that direction. And also, there need to be options for solo players or teams without a healer to be effective and have some form of viable self-sustain, so that not every team purely relies on a healer, which I would argue is possible at the moment, even though, of course, a lot of people will say that a team with a healer will generally perform better. But I think if you effectively counterplay and counterbuild, it is possible to deal with a team that has a healer without having a healer as well. To achieve these goals, they have enhanced the main counters via the buffs to Plague perks, and in Season 4 we're also seeing the Anointed and Sacred Ground changes, so that will heal a little less, especially through pods. And also that allowed them to remove the decreased efficiency of pods, which effectively means that everyone else will heal a little bit more. That's the self-sustain coming in, and that is also happening through the Shirking Heals rebuff. Now, they're not expecting to hit balance perfectly, but they want to tackle these 4 points, and they will continue to do so. They are also, on a longer basis, looking at healing as a whole. They want to see if it's fun and active enough, because currently a lot of the heals are passive or just AoE or not very targeted or something. And they also want to make other weapons more viable for swapping or combos somehow. Not quite sure if this is specifically referring to offhands for life staff. I'm assuming that's what they mean here. What I am wondering about is how they want to make healing more fun or more engaging or whatever, with how clunky a lot of the healing system currently is. I find that one of the main reasons why I personally really don't want to touch healing is because of the way that you navigate your group and all the inputs that you need to do in order to do that effectively. And I don't really know how they can introduce more mechanics to healing without improving that in general first. Also, if it's healing that's not targeted through the party menu, they really need to improve the group visibility for PvP situations. I don't know why that hasn't happened at this point. They really need to make better team markers and stuff like that. They did the Splash of Light range nerf and thought that they probably went a little bit too far with that. They wanted to create a standardized range for all heals so that it also matches with the UI, which grays out when they are beyond 25 meters. So you know, okay, at this point no heal will connect anymore. Generally, Splash of Light is a very strong ability. It doesn't require line of sight. It doesn't require allies to be grouped in any way. And David thinks it still has a good spot in the game. So they have no plans to change the distance, but it is more likely to be buffed in other ways if it turns out that that's needed. And I can totally see that approach. I thought that this guaranteed massive radius AoE was always a bit of a weird heal. I feel like a little bit more active healing that at least requires some degree of positioning is generally better. If you're enjoying the video so far, consider subscribing and clicking the bell, and if you'd like to support me further, you can do so on my Patreon. Blunderbuss received nerfs to survivability and damage, but kind of also received at least some degree of buffs through the disease changes. And David says it's definitely still on the stronger side and they're keeping an eye on it, but currently they have no further changes for Season 4 planned. You may remember that when they first talked about the Flail, it was kind of just performing fairly average. Now it is performing pretty well. Over time the usage and win rate have both increased, the damage not so much. It's doing well in all PvP modes now, however there are also bugs that may affect this, such as it inheriting the reaction from certain effects, which is going to be fixed now in the patch yesterday, as well as the permanent haste bug. As a Flail player who doesn't use the ability that gives you the perma-haste, I believe that the Flail will still be fairly strong after this. It's just a weapon that doesn't show its power in the same way that others do, because you're not really seeing big damage numbers in the same way. It's just a massive amount of disruption, and it can be countered effectively as well if you know how to. They're keeping an eye on the Flail after the fixes. Now we have, once again, Boltcaster. So they were a bit nervous going in with Boltcaster before the PTR already. They wanted to have a cool and unique passive with a stun. However, they realized that it's fun for the bow user, but not for the recipients. It's okay in solo fight, but a problem in big group fights especially. When you have multiple Boltcasters around, when you have healing going on, if you have AoE stuns and all that stuff. So they are removing the stun and they're replacing it with a new passive. For every basic attack you hit someone with, you gain a lightning charge. At 3 charges, you do a big pop of damage. We don't know how much that will be, but I would expect this to be extremely good for Boltcaster overall. I made a video that I haven't released yet, and I may have to redo it a little bit at this point, where I went a bit deeper into the numbers behind Boltcaster and how it performs now. That will be coming in the next days. Again, subscribe if you want to see it. There I will talk about the details of Boltcaster and how it performs just in raw damage without even considering the passive at all. And I think that'll show how much potential there is behind this change. It might actually, in some scenarios at least, be scarier than the stun itself. We'll see, but I think this is definitely a better approach with hitting the same target multiple times that has more counterplay and so on. So that comes down to what number they're choosing here for this big pop of damage. The gem changes were very powerful in PTR and they're tuning this down. That is understandable. I did some testing that I can also show you in the next days probably, and it did not look good for anything that didn't use int. With 75% in scaling now being the new value and 65% focus scaling from previously at 90 and 80% respectively, so quite a significant nerf here in this scaling output. David says that gems will still be very powerful, and I agree, they're just not going to be completely overbearing and gonna be like half of the builds essentially. In the context of these gem changes, they also once again had to look at the int perks, and I'm really glad that they did, because something that I have been saying for a long time is finally happening now. They realized that the int perks, the attribute perks, are just stronger than a lot of the others, so that's why it ended up being worth it to go into these int specs, even with strength or dex weapons with the gems, because you just get the better perks from that. And what they're going to do with a Season 4 patch now is they're going to nerf the 150 attribute point bonus down from 15% to 10% elemental damage. And that is a very, very crucial nerf in my opinion, because this basically affects everything most mage builds do, and this always felt like a very overbearing, necessary strong perk that made builds that also utilize split gems and 150 int extremely powerful, and that will all be trimmed down a little bit here, I would say. And they do say that there is also a possible additional change in the future. That's something they didn't talk about yet. But I do think that this, especially this 150 int perk, is one that most certainly needed a nerf. I would say the most of all perks. So very, very glad to see that. And that's going to lead to some interesting build changes in general, I believe. Obviously, it is especially worth mentioning that this nerfs split gem bows as well as Boltcaster too. So we might see more of a return of the Dex bow in general, but more on that in another video. We're also getting some buffs from the PTR. So Endless Thirst is the least used but most owned jewelry artifact, and the penalty here, the cooldown increase, is now getting reduced down to 25%, whereas on PTR was showing us 40%. Both of the perks coming with it have also been buffed, we don't know in what way though. Koya's knee guards were previously only physical mitigation, and they want to make them more broadly applicable by giving them all ranged damage reduction. But in return they're nerfing the value. David said 10% is likely going to be what they're selling for here. So you're going to effectively have 10% physical aversion and 10% elemental aversion in one piece of armor, and then on top of that, that piece also has additional physical aversion, which may be more relevant with the next patch, depending on how things develop with the bow. So I think these are going to be relatively interesting for quite a few builds. I'm thinking especially light users who are using featherweight, you can probably offset some of the loss of reduction that you get otherwise against melees by just slotting some more onyxes, depending on what melee you're facing, but I think that would generally be effective. And then alongside with that, also maybe certain medium builds. So I think that really makes them one of the more considerable options for many players. This is of course especially true for Outpost Rush, where ranged is generally very popular, and may also make these ones outshine quick draw gloves fairly significantly. Inferno gets its Hellfire's Fury radius increased from 8 to 15 meters, that is the 20% damage bonus. Now Inferno still has scaling issues when running it with strength, which means that the dots are not scaling properly, so I think there's still work to be done in Inferno. Maybe that'll also be fixed, and maybe then that's something worth looking at. Until then, probably not. So more on Boltcaster, the int gems, as well as what I've been up to essentially in the next days. If you're interested in any of that, consider subscribing, clicking the bell, and a huge thanks to my Patreons for supporting this video. If you'd like to do that too, and you want to have a way to directly reach me on Discord, then feel free to do so on my Patreon. Thanks for watching. SLOTH out.